Well, good evening, everyone. If you'll find a seat, we'll get our program started this evening. My name is John Beckford. I am the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean here at Furman. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you on the final event in Furman's International Symposium, China's Environmental Crisis, Is There a Way Out? Well, tonight I don't want you to find a way out. I want you to remain here and be fully engaged with our speaker this evening. I want to congratulate those of you who attended all of the lectures and panel discussions over the last day and a half. You have been treated to a range of expertise and knowledge that has been thoughtfully and responsibly engaging us in a topic that we should not ignore, even for people who live halfway across the world from China. One of the great pleasures for me in working here at Furman University is observing our ability to bring together various academic programs to collectively respond to major issues. This symposium is the product of 4 major departments and programs recognizing the expertise each bring toward advancing a high-level discussion of a topic of significant interest. Like all major questions we face in the world today, no single discipline will have all the answers. We live in a complex world that requires understanding of those complexities and a willingness to collaborate across disciplines in solving these problems. So the idea of this international symposium brought together some of Furman's finest. The Riley Institute, with its reputation for engagement in matters of public policy, and of course behind that is our good Dr. Don Gordon and his highly effective staff. We also know that it was our Department of Political Science that compels our students to understand political and governance issues, that it's been highly instrumental in shaping this conference. Those political science graduates populate some of the highest public and private offices across the country and around the world. And most recently, maybe you were aware, this last summer, our 1993 graduate in political science, Alexander Stubb, was elected Prime Minister of Finland. We also have the Department of Asian Studies that has emerged as one of the premier undergraduate programs of its kind in the country. The department grew out of a curricular requirement asking every student to take a course related to Africa or Asia. And over time, Furman made a strategic decision to acknowledge the rise and influence of Asian affairs. So we added faculty and resources and gave the program departmental status. Now we boast 15 faculty affiliated with the Department of Asian Studies, covering expertise in Japan, China, and South Asian arenas. Dr. Kate Kaup has led this department's contribution to our symposium this week, and you will hear from her in a moment. And finally, but not least of all, is the Schei Center for Sustainability, a pioneer for engaging higher education in its responsibility toward environmental issues. While their faculty director, Dr. Angela Halfacre, is on sabbatical this semester, I want to thank Ms. Yancy Fouché for assisting in this event. So here we are at Furman, not an institution that is filled with siloed departments, but one that recognizes strength in collaboration, where we understand that multidisciplinary solutions are the most long-lasting, and where seeking those solutions illuminates more responsible decision-making. Tonight, and for the entire symposium, I'm thankful that I work at a small liberal arts college where these kinds of events are a product of the type of thinking we pass on to our students and to a wider public. I hope you enjoyed tonight's remarks. Let me now introduce Dr. Kate Kaup, a former chair of the Asian Studies Department and was a principal in organizing this event tonight. Kate?
Well, Thank you, Dr. Beckford, and thanks again and welcome again to all of you who have been here for the duration, starting from our opening keynote address last night, our panel presentation this afternoon, and now our closing keynote by Patricia Adams. Let me also just reiterate Dr. Beckford's comments and thank again the Riley Institute for its outstanding programming, the Political Science Department for its support of the program, the Shy Center, and the Department of Asian Studies. It's also part of the larger Luce initiative in Asian Studies and the Environment at Furman, so we're appreciative of the Luce Foundation. And I know we have a couple of journalists in the audience, so if you're looking for good stories over the next few weeks, we have a group of 14 faculty members who are coming together from across the disciplines. We have 7 natural scientists working with the China specialist and the head of our urban studies program to really focus in on China's environmental issues, to develop some new exciting curriculum with our partner in Yunnan province, and we'll actually be traveling together to China next June and July. So if you're interested in joining this interesting initiative across campus, please shoot me an email or look for the other faculty members involved. We have a liaison student task force that's going to be formed in the next few weeks, and lots going on campus, including a multi-day film festival in the spring organized by Dr. Blumenfield in the Asian Studies Department. Tonight I have the distinct honor of introducing our keynote speaker. And before I do that, some of you may have seen our press releases 2 weeks ago when we thought that Dai Ching was going to join us for our conference the last couple of days. Unfortunately, she did not get the permissions that she needed to join us this conference. So we are delighted that Patricia Adams was able to come and join the conference. I would like to just take a minute to appreciate the folks that are doing such exciting and important work from within China, working very bravely to address a very complex set of issues that we'll be talking about tonight. So Patricia Adams joins us all the way from Canada, not China, but Canada. So an internationally recognized and respected advocate on behalf of China's environment and global environmental issues. Probe International is part of a network, an independent think tank that monitors Canadian government involvement and multinational companies' activities and their impact on the environment globally. And I think she'll probably tell you a little bit about her involvement and interaction and how they became directly connected with Chinese environmental issues. But we are delighted to have her here. She's by training an economist, has published several books addressing a wide range of issues, and organizes Probe International's efforts on the Chinese environmental initiatives. And I will hand it over without further ado. Thanks for joining us, Pat.
Thank you very much, Kate and John. And thank you very much to the Riley Institute, to Furman University, to the faculty, to the staff, and to the students. The students are extraordinary. In fact, we were talking this morning with staff about how inspiring it is to work with you. And I especially want to thank you for making us feel at home, the speakers at home, and to giving us such a gracious welcome. As Kate just mentioned, we had all hoped that Dai Ching, a rocket scientist, did you know she was a rocket scientist? She was, before she became a journalist and then an environmentalist. We had all hoped that she would be here. She was going to discuss the challenges that journalists and environmentalists in China face when they try to speak the truth about the environmental consequences of China's development policies. I'm not going to try to represent Dai Ching, though I may quote her, because as a dear colleague of 25 years and as a fellow of my organization, she has inspired us, and she has given us many, many insights into China and also into our own societies. Indeed, it's because of Dai Ching that my organization, Probe International, based in Canada, became so involved in the Chinese environmental issue. In 1986, with factions of the Chinese government debating whether or not to go ahead and build the Three Gorges Dam, the Canadian government announced that it would finance and produce a feasibility study. Now, this was called a bankable feasibility study. The purpose of it was to allow the Chinese government to go out and raise financing to build the dam. The Canadian government was very, very clear. It wanted to get a foot in the door so that if the Chinese government decided to proceed with the dam, the Canadian government could secure contracts for Canadian companies. So they completed the study. When it was finished, we used our Access to Information Act, which is like your FOIA, and we requested it and we got it. I should add that this was actually the first time that a feasibility study for a major international development project had ever been disclosed to the public. The engineers that carried it out never expected it to be public. The feasibility study itself was huge. It was called the best in the world. In future, all feasibility studies would aspire to be as good as this one. It included about 3,000 pages. I think there were 13 volumes, filled 3 boxes, stacked up. It stood about this high. It was enormous. So we managed to get this copy, and when we received it, we divided it up and we sent it to various experts around the world and asked them if they would review it from their area of expertise. And their findings were shocking. For example, they didn't look at the sedimentation data for the Yangtze. So they underestimated and really didn't come to grips with what the consequences would be of damming the sediment in the Yangtze behind the Three Gorges Dam. They did not look properly at the phenomena of reservoir-induced seismicity. And they also, amazingly, recommended that tens of thousands of people continue to live around the perimeter of the reservoir in what's called the active flood storage zone. Now, this means that these people would be subjected to regular flooding. The reason they did this was to keep the resettlement numbers down. Of course, Three Gorges was famous, among other things, for the number of people that it would resettle. Now, their findings of the independent experts that we contacted were so shocking that we published their findings in this book called Damming the Three Gorges: What Dam Builders Don't Want You to Know. Now, it seems kind of dull. It's a critique of a feasibility study, but it flew off the shelves. Nobody had ever seen these official feasibility studies before, and everyone wanted to know, what were the engineers doing behind the scenes? After we finished publishing that book, we then filed complaints against the engineering firms with their regulatory bodies. And we argued that they were guilty of negligence, incompetence, and professional misconduct for violating their codes of ethics, which at their very basic level say that an engineer's duty is to protect life and property. Now, while we were doing this, our preparation of the book was all occurring in the months leading up to June 4th, 1989. Just as we were finishing our book, we heard that another book that was critical of Three Gorges had been published in China, and it was called Yangtze. And we had heard that it was published by a journalist who was unknown to me at the time. Her name was Dai Ching. Her book, which is right here, we've translated it into English, is a collection of arguments by the most eminent scholars in China against the dam. Dai Ching and her team of journalists distributed Yangtze in February of 1989 to all state council delegates, leading them to postpone a decision to dam the river for 5 years. It was absolutely stunning news, and it was unprecedented. The Far Eastern Economic Review called it a watershed event in post-1949 Chinese politics. representing the first use of public lobbying by intellectuals and public figures. Now, this would all soon end with the events of June 4th, after which Dai Qing was jailed for 10 months. And in the aftermath of June 4th, the forces that were in favor of building the Three Gorges Dam mobilized to badger the National People's Congress into approving construction of the dam in 1992. And China's so-called rise began. So here we are, almost 25 years later. The Three Gorges Dam is built, and China's environment is more seriously polluted and degraded than any other on Earth. Now, last night, Jennifer Turner gave you the gripping, breathtaking, horrifying details of the state of China's environment. According to the Geological Survey of China, 90% of the country's groundwater is polluted. Much of it is too toxic for fishing, drinking, and even industrial use. Urban areas are so polluted that 74 cities that were surveyed by the government exceeded World Health Organization air standards. The countryside, meanwhile, is no refuge. Indeed, it has been said that the rural areas are at risk of becoming a toilet, with 243 million tons of feces and 163 million tons of urine from livestock every year. And that, said the UK's Guardian newspaper, is not even counting the nasty chemical cocktail of pesticides, herbicides, nitrogen fertilizer, and growth stimulants. China's Ministry of Environmental Protection and the Ministry of Land and Resources recently released results of a nationwide soil pollution survey, and it isn't pretty. 1/5 of the country's arable land is polluted and contaminated with inorganic chemicals like cadmium, nickel, and arsenic. The situation is so bad that even the government now recognizes and has acknowledged the existence of some 450 cancer villages where power plants and industrial facilities are poisoning villagers' water and air, causing unusually high levels of death. And despite reforms to the country's largely uncoordinated and often corrupt food registry network, scandals involving contaminated and even toxic food continue to plague China, and the country's food continues to be regarded as a likely source of poisons. So with China's billion-plus citizens afraid to drink the water, eat the food, and breathe the air, with the rise of public protests over environmental issues, the government of President Xi Jinping has declared war on pollution. But war is the wrong metaphor. And the command and control tools that are employed in wartime, though they're very familiar to the Communist Party, will not fix China's environment. Let me illustrate by analyzing China's continual episodes of air pollution, so bad that they're dubbed airpocalypses, which at many times are so bad that even bus drivers lose their way on their routes. Now, many of you may remember last March of this year when China's 3,000 National People's Congress delegates descended on Beijing under a crippling smog, that public concern about the smog was riding high. And so the government decided to move the environment up the agenda. To deal with smog in China's cities, desperate authorities began throwing everything they could at the problem. They confiscated outdoor barbecues. They closed some factories. They dispatched inspectors. And they threatened death sentence for polluters. But these measures are logical, but they're ineffective. And they failed utterly. They're logical because, given China's system of governance, other measures have been unavailable to those responsible for keeping the air clean. They're ineffective because these scattershot measures mostly miss their mark, and they ignore the reasons that China's air pollution has reached apocalyptic levels. The worst polluters are coal-fired power plants and factory boilers, motor vehicles, and the construction industry. Together, they blanket China's major cities with pollutants that are 40 times levels considered safe by the World Health Organization. Why does the government target barbecues and individuals instead of major polluters? Because it knows how to deprive ordinary citizens of their property and their lives. It doesn't know how to regulate an incoherent economy bereft of market discipline. Let's get into some of the detail about the dysfunction. The air in China is polluted in good part because China imports cheap fuels. China is the world's largest purchaser of low-grade petroleum. And China doesn't refine oil to a high level. The result is that there are extraordinarily high levels of pollution. The sulfur content in China's gasoline is 5 to 15 times that of the US or Europe. Why doesn't China refine its oil to higher, cleaner levels? It isn't because China doesn't have the know-how. It does. We would happily refine oil to a higher level, the state oil giants PetroChina and Sinopec told China's leaders. Just let us recoup our costs by telling the state planners who set prices at the pump to raise prices. The answer from the Chinese leadership has been no. It fears that higher fuel prices will lead to inflation and social unrest. Even if the Chinese leadership agreed to raise fuel prices, and if the state oil giants produced cleaner fuels, it wouldn't help much. Everybody knows that the fuel that's ultimately pumped into automobiles would be dirty. Gas pump operators are notorious for adulterating the low-quality fuels that they purchase from the giants with the even lower quality fuels from freelancers. It also wouldn't help much because China's vehicles don't use catalytic converters. Automobile manufacturers, and car purchasers for that matter, see no point in investing in them because the dirty fuel that they get at the pump would damage them. It gets worse. The electric power sector is similarly booby-trapped. The mandated price of electricity is so low that the state electric utilities can't afford to invest in cleaner coal-burning power plants. And again, the government won't let it recoup its costs. Likewise, because the price of natural gas is high, the electric utilities can't afford to invest in much cleaner burning gas-fired plants. And even if the state-owned energy companies, who are notorious for violating environmental rules, even if these state-owned companies could pass on the higher cost of the higher refined fuels, the cleaner fuels, and scrubbing the smokestack effluents, citizens would not be confident that they weren't simultaneously being gouged and polluted. Without transparency and regulatory accountability, there's no way to know for sure. And then they might take their ire out on the government. And the government knows this. The citizens' distrust is understandable. China's central government is very good at announcing targets to reduce sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide emissions, but the government is incapable of enforcing them. For years, China's leaders have promised to clean up the air, and for years, inspectors have been bribed to ignore infractions. Local officials, meanwhile, have allowed polluters to set up shop in their communities in return for bribes and taxes. Meanwhile, air quality worsens. China has a Ministry of Environmental Protection, but it is virtually toothless. It has little power to sue violators. Even if it did, suits are pointless because the judicial system delivers verdicts that the Communist Party determines. It's called telephone justice. The verdict is telephoned in to the judge. State-owned institutions are vehicles for payments to party cronies, and they are effectively immune from the courts. Because pollution is the number one cause of popular dissent, the Chinese government has introduced a 4-tiered air quality measure to quell public outrage. At the blue level, all is well. At the yellow level, it's acceptable. At orange and then red, factories and power plants must be shut and cars yanked off the roads. Yet when Beijing's smog levels went, as they said, off the charts in January, the code remained at yellow. Why doesn't the government declare an emergency? Everyone, including the state media, was asking. The answer is provided by Ma Jun, head of the Beijing-based Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs. Jennifer showed a picture of him last night in her slideshow. He's the fellow who is the former journalist. According to Ma Jun, the government is reluctant to raise the alert level because doing so would shut down the economy. Declaring an emergency simply isn't feasible, says Ma Jun. The government is also very reluctant to declare an emergency out of fear that they couldn't make the declaration stick. Enterprises and drivers are likely to ignore high alert levels, exposing the government's edicts for what they are: hot air. China's air isn't polluted because the technologies to keep it clean are unavailable. The air is polluted because the country lacks a credible regulatory regime that makes polluters pay and rewards investors to innovate. Instead of a war on pollution, China needs a peaceful process of denationalization and lawmaking. The goal should be to reverse the policy in which the state advances and the private sector recedes. Instead, the goal should be to have the private sector advance and be disciplined by markets and laws that empower citizens to protect their air and their watersheds. Let me explain by looking at a couple of examples of hydrodams. A recent study came out of Oxford University recently, and it has documented that large dams are not economically viable. They cost close to twice as much as projected, and this doesn't even include the negative social and environmental costs or the effects of inflation and debt servicing. Now, this is not new information. We've known this for many years. Large hydrodams are capital intensive, and they have never been built without subsidies provided by the deep pockets of taxpayers and ratepayers in countries all over the world, not just in China. But there's no better example of this than the Three Gorges Dam. Now, officials estimate that the cost of Three Gorges is $23 billion. No one believes that number. The best estimate of the cost of Three Gorges by independent researchers is closer to $60 billion. And needless to say, the dam was built by a state-owned enterprise. How was it financed? Well, in a variety of ways. Every single electricity consumer in China, big and small, pays a special charge on their electricity bill that went into what was known as the Three Gorges Construction Fund. Now, after construction finished, and it became apparent that the environmental problems with the dam were going to require very expensive remedial measures and the resettlement of still more people, officials changed the name of the fund. And it is now called the National Fund for Major Water Resource Projects. And everybody in the country pays that. China's electricity ratepayers continue to pay for the never-ending costs of Three Gorges. Now, this wasn't the only source of financing. The Three Gorges Corporation, like most state-owned enterprises in China, borrows cheap capital from the state banking sector. Because the state restrictions on investment vehicles, Chinese citizens have very few choices about where they can invest their savings and deposit their money. They inevitably deposit it into state banks at well below market interest rates. The Chinese state banking sector thus becomes a very important source of subsidized capital, not just for Three Gorges, but for all of the other numerous dams that are now being built in southwest China. But there's another trick that they used. We've seen this happen in Canada as well. When it became obvious that power generation from Three Gorges was the only revenue source, and every other part of the Three Gorges operations was just a drain on the public purse, the state privatized the turbines and the generators into a private company that's now traded on stock exchanges so that they could continue to operate in financial markets. And meanwhile, what they did was they segregated the money-losing operations in a separate, it remains a state-owned company. And that continues to be bailed out by taxpayers and ratepayers. But the state has to commandeer more than money when they want to build their dams. Dam builders need to flood people off their land. Consider this for a moment. What would happen if an American state or an agency like the Tennessee Valley Authority proposed to flood over 1 million people off their land to build a hydro dam? It simply wouldn't happen. No government would survive the next election. And the regulatory test would likely stop the scheme if the costs of compensating so many people didn't. In China, dam builders need the power of expropriation without fair compensation. And they have it. Dam owners also need immunity from liability for the many costs and risks that they trigger, such as landslides, earthquakes, the destruction of fish stocks, and the elimination of economic activity as a result of altered sediment and water flows, saltwater intrusion down at the estuary, and so on. In China, they have that immunity. Now, just how big are these costs? Well, they're huge. Fan Chao, who is one of China's most respected and forthright geologists from the Sichuan Geology and Mineral Bureau, estimates that due to the scouring effect of the silt-free water that is released from the Three Gorges Dam, downstream riverbanks have collapsed and the Yangtze's riverbed has dropped 11 meters. The economic costs of this altered hydrology are absolutely enormous. The water table has dropped, drought has ensued, ships have been beached. But perhaps the most profound effect is that Lakes Poyang and Dongting, China's largest freshwater lakes, and environmentally and economically crucial floodplains downstream of the dam, are now higher than the Yangtze, and they are draining into the Yangtze and flowing out to the sea. The effect of this is to kill off fish stocks and deprive millions of people who once depended on the fish in those two freshwater lakes for their livelihood and for their protein. Now, surely you were probably thinking, well, there must be some benefits from the Three Gorges Dam. How about power production or flood control? Well, the price per kilowatt of power that's produced by Three Gorges is 4 times higher than the national standard set by China's State Electricity Regulatory Commission. Other deadly risks have been introduced by the dam's operations. Chinese officials now admit that the constantly rising and falling reservoir level, and this has to happen, levels have to be high in order to generate power, and then they have to be lowered in order to absorb floodwaters. But this constant up and down of the reservoir is triggering landslides in some 5,000 what are called hotspots around the reservoir. This is requiring the evacuation of 300,000 more people over the 1.4 million people who were already moved to make way for the dam. Meanwhile, a study by seismologists at the China Earthquake Administration have said that the dam has increased seismic activity 30-fold, that's 30, in a phenomenon called reservoir-induced seismicity. While Chinese officials were quick to crow that the dam would harness the power of the Yangtze River and produce clean energy, it isn't clear how long that's going to last. Geologist Fan Chao, again, has said in a study that dam developers have built so many dams on the Yangtze that their combined reservoir volume will exceed the Yangtze's flow. There simply isn't enough water in the mighty Yangtze to fill all of the dams to their designed capacity, resulting, as he says, in an enormous waste of money. Even the chairman of China Three Gorges Corporation, the state-owned company that's responsible for the dam, acknowledges that his dam is going to face stiff competition for water when all the other dams are completed. Well, what about flood control? Officials have always fallen back on the dam's ability to control floods to justify the project's enormous human and environmental costs. But even those arguments are growing flimsy. Officials now admit that the dam's storage capacity is smaller than claimed and of questionable benefit in the event of a major flood. Other dams fare no better. Thanks to the determined analysis of Chinese geologists like Fan Chao and others, the science of reservoir-induced seismicity now suggests that the magnitude 8 earthquake that hit Sichuan province in May of 2008 and killed upwards of 90,000 people was in all likelihood triggered by the operations of the Zipingpu Dam. And the spate of earthquakes that have hit China very recently are now thought to have been triggered by many of the other dams that are being built in southwest China. Now, will environmental impact assessments help stop environmentally costly projects like Three Gorges from being repeated? Unlikely. And here's why. For one, none of the costly environmental consequences of building the Three Gorges Dam were unknown. They were all predicted in this book 20 years ago. The dam was built because the environmental and social consequences were immaterial to those making the decision. The Communist Party brass wanted to build the Three Gorges Dam, just as it wants to build the 130 more dams that are now under construction upstream of Three Gorges in the southwest area of China. They want to build them for prestige, for chauvinistic reasons, for power, yes, and for influence peddling and corruption. For years, Daicheng has called the Three Gorges Dam a big fishing project for the benefit groups, a black hole of corruption and a gold mine for corrupt officials. Today's Chinese leaders admit privately that it was an expensive white elephant and that Daicheng was right all along. After years of receiving kid glove treatment in which the media was prohibited from publishing anything critical about Three Gorges, Chinese President Xi has trained his sweeping campaign to root out graft and curb abuse of power on the Three Gorges Corporation. To the surprise of many, earlier this year, the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, which is an internal Communist Party watchdog, announced that it had found officials at the Three Gorges Corporation guilty of nepotism, shady property deals, and dodgy bidding practices. The chairman and the general manager have been replaced, and the investigation is ongoing. Needless to say, the detailed findings of the investigators remain under wraps, while earlier attempts by independent lawyers at the Beijing-based Transition Institute to secure records of Three Gorges costs using China's new access to information law have failed and failed and failed again in the court system. As long as lawmakers are unaccountable to the populace, as long as laws are non-existent or unenforced, and the courts are dysfunctional, and as long as the state controls access to capital and can commandeer resources at will and without compensation, China's environment will continue to be misused and its citizens and economy will suffer. Many assume that the solutions to China's environmental problems are better technologies. Scrubbers on smokestacks, higher fuel standards, hazardous waste treatment facilities, solar and wind power instead of hydro dams and coal. And to be sure, they're all going to play a role in a cleaner economy. But without tackling the root causes of China's environmental decay, they will be ineffective. Without market discipline, without a free press and free speech, without liability for decisions that put lives and property at risk, without an informed public that is free to challenge lawmakers and throw them out of office at the ballot box, without the rule of law that gives citizens the right to protect themselves from harm, governments will be able to externalize the cost of decisions onto the citizenry with impunity. And they will continue to justify those decisions with feasibility studies and environmental assessments that are nothing more than propaganda. As with the South-North Water Diversion Project that Jennifer referred to last night, which will divert water from the Yangtze 1,000 kilometers north to quench Beijing's thirst, the Chinese government does what it knows how to do. It pours concrete and it moves people out of the way. Jennifer said last night that everything China does is big, and that is true, but it need not be so. The more elegant and effective solutions, and there are many that we know about, and there are many that we haven't even thought about, such as using markets and laws to reflect water scarcity, such as incentivizing Beijing's residents and entrepreneurs to rehabilitate the watershed, recharge the groundwater and the aquifers. These are more difficult to craft, especially given the institutional desert that the Communist Party has created. I would argue that environmentally damaging projects and policies can only proceed if environmental destroyers receive statutory permission to do so, if they receive immunity from liability, if they receive subsidies to compensate for the financial risks of their activity, and if they have a regulatory regime that gives them monopoly powers to protect their rate of return. The hydro dam industry is a very good example of how this distortion in incentives occurs. Without subsidies, immunities, and market protection that I've described, and without the prospect of those rich fishing projects, there would be very few large hydro dams in the world. Big dams are simply too financially and environmentally costly for the private sector to invest in. Only the state, with its deep pockets and its powers of expropriation, can externalize those costs onto citizens to the benefit of cronies. But of course, those costs, though uncounted and unrecognized, are nevertheless real. And they undermine the well-being of the citizenry and have an insidious effect on the Chinese economy and the environment. Give citizens the tools to force the beneficiaries to internalize the costs and to compensate the victims, and you will find that China's economy and environment will thrive together. Many commentators see China's massive population and its desire to pursue profits and to raise their standard of living as one of the gravest threats, not only to the Chinese environment, but to the global environment too. I don't see them that way at all. I see the Chinese government as the largest threat, and the citizenry as the world's largest group of frontline defenders of the environment. I think we need to remember for every national or global environmental threat, whether it's to air, water, or land, there will be local victims who feel the consequences first and most painfully. Give Chinese citizens the right to know, the legal and the political tools, and the security to exercise their rights and to hold accountable those who would destroy their environment. And costly investments will be rejected and sustainable investments favored. And the innovation that will occur as Chinese citizens invest to meet each other's needs in an economy governed by the rule of law will be truly awesome. Give power to the people of China to protect their environment, and China will thrive. And so too will the rest of the world as a result. Thank you. Yes, by all means.
I think she'll take questions if you have questions, and there's a microphone floating about.
This is why I sit in the front row. You mentioned that Canada did the feasibility study.
Yeah.
And part of the outcomes that they were hoping that the feasibility study would provide would be the opportunity to participate in the construction. To what extent was there construction contracts and some sort of economic benefit that Canada received over the Three Gorges Dam project?
There were a number of contracts that were awarded to Canadian firms, not the same engineering firms that actually did the feasibility study, but to other firms. Canada General Electric it was part of General Electric where turbines and generators were made in Quebec, and they received a contract. Very interesting. In the turbine and generator contracts that the Chinese awarded, part of the condition was that the Western companies, and CGE was one of them, had to train the Chinese how to do them, how to make the generators and the turbines themselves, and that had a very interesting effect over the years. Today, we now see that China is the major dam builder around the world. It used to be Canada, and there was this transfer of technology as a result of Three Gorges and a few other dams that occurred. As a result of the construction going ahead. So Canadian General Electric got contracts. There was another contract, a concrete preparation contract. Another engineering firm got a very large contract to provide what we called a supercomputer, which was sort of a project management computer system. One of the very interesting sort of ends to the story is that the 5 firms that did the feasibility study, 2 of them were state enterprises. One was Hydro-Quebec, which you may be familiar with, the company that state-owned provincial utility that wanted to build the very damaging James Bay projects, and British Columbia Hydro. And then the other 3 firms were private. One was called Acres International, based in Toronto, and 2 of them were in Quebec. SNC and Lavalin, 2 different companies at the time. Acres International has since gone out of business because they were convicted of bribing officials in Lesotho on a major dam building project. And SNC-Lavalin they're now the same company, and they are in the midst of approximately 6 corruption investigations. So the companies have not fared well in the years after the Three Gorges feasibility study.
You mentioned that an Oxford University study concluded that large dams are not usually economically viable. So my question is, how likely is it that the state will increase water and energy prices so that conservation is a more prominent focus, and so that projects such as Three Gorges and others are more beneficial to the Chinese state in general?
Good question. I don't think it's all that likely. I think there are a number of things that the government fears, and one of them is inflation. And so I think they're very nervous about increasing energy prices, which are so fundamental. The same thing applies to water, actually. A number of environmental groups in China that we work with have been advocating raising water prices. Water prices in China are very low, and much lower than the US and in Europe and Canada. And the effect of this is that it encourages consumption. It does not encourage conservation. And I think that the Chinese authorities know this. this has come up in many of the discussions before, that they understand the dysfunction. The officials know that there's a problem. They're caught in this terrible box, and their toolkits are not big. In our countries, we have court systems. We have lots of laws that have been tested and used over the years. Citizens feel comfortable going to the courts and using them, going to regulatory bodies. But there's a deep well of institutions in our countries that don't exist yet in China. And there are many environmental groups and some public interest groups that are working hard to start introducing some of these laws. Many of them come and work with us in Canada and spend time visiting regulatory bodies, going to the courts and seeing how they function. So the environmental issue is a really interesting one, I think, because it's very multidisciplinary, but it also, you start with a very dramatic problem, which is that you can't breathe the air and drink the water and feel secure. And it very quickly leads you to an investigation of why did these decisions get made? And before you know it, you start examining the finances behind a lot of these investments, the regulatory regimes that either don't exist or are dysfunctional, that can't somehow protect citizens against these polluters. And so before you know it, you're actually looking at institutions, at governance. And it's a fascinating subject. But I don't think it's very likely. I think one of the ways that the Chinese government keeps citizens harmonious, keeps them reasonably happy, is by having low prices. So I wouldn't hold out hope. The Three Gorges Dam is also, as with all these other dams, are incredibly expensive. There are much better ways to generate power than with hydro dams. So I don't think it makes sense. I mean, even if they could recover costs for it, then I don't know if that would cause rebellion in the streets. And so what they do is they disguise it. They will get it out of general revenues, or they'll get it from, for example, from this construction fund that changed its name.
Thank you. Patricia, I just want to thank you very much for your comments tonight. I think that it really helps to ratchet our focus backward a little bit from the issues that maybe can be solved with technical solutions to the root causes. And yet I know that although you've painted an extremely depressing picture for us and then just said that the solutions you've proposed are not likely to occur, I know that your organization is doing work with people in China. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about the strategies your organization is using given this rather grave situation.
Well, as I said, we realize the root of the problem is the absence of rule of law and accountability of lawmakers. And so many of the groups that we work with, all of the groups that we work with, essentially, we're looking at regulatory reforms. And many of our colleagues actually are lawyers. Now, one thing that the Chinese government could stop doing is throwing these public interest lawyers into jail. That would help a great deal. I don't know if you know the legal system and the licensing system in China, but lawyers have to apply every year for a license, I think from the Ministry of Justice. And if the Ministry of Justice doesn't like them, then they just don't get their license for that year and they can't practice. Beyond that, the lawyers who take on public interest cases are very often themselves, they're delicensed, or sometimes they're actually thrown in jail themselves. So and there are not very many of these public interest lawyers, so it would certainly help. This would be a reform that the government could introduce right away. There was another very interesting innovation a couple of years ago. I think it was in 2009 when the Beijing Lawyers Association actually introduced a system for self-governance similar to our bar associations. And when you read it, it was like a very good description of parliamentary system, Robert's Rules of Order, and the people who had drafted it for the Beijing Lawyers Association were punished. As a result, they were delicensed. So as a starter, the government could start allowing these lawyers peace and allow them to operate and to practice. That's one thing that could happen. The other thing that we do is, we have several approaches. One is to get information that is not otherwise published into the public domain. And this is what we started doing with Daicheng 20 years ago. And she continues to be a mentor for all of these environmental groups and public interest research groups in China. So we, in the case of Fan Chao, for example, he is doing really just extraordinary research on the relationship between hydro dam operation and reservoir-induced seismicity. This is a fairly new area of science because it's only as old as long as we've been building hydro dams, and they aren't that old. And so the experiment is being run in China. That's where all of the big dams are being built, and they're in very seismically active areas. So he is monitoring it very closely, and he's crunching the numbers and looking at the reservoir operations and looking at the seismic data. One of the handicaps that he faces, and there are many other geologists as well in this situation, is that the government has a very fine monitoring system for fine seismic measurements, but they won't disclose that detail. Well, they should. I mean, this is a matter of public safety. They should disclose the detail to all the scientists so that there can be a good, thorough scientific examination of the relationship between the operations of these dams and the earthquakes. In that case, what we're doing is trying to get that information into the public domain. We publish both in Chinese on our website and in English. We have 2 different websites, and we publish a couple of other websites from China as well. So our approach is really to empower the people with information. And of course, this is why the internet has been so powerful in China, is because people can exchange this information themselves. The last thing that I would add is that many of our colleagues are press and lawyers and environmentalists. And when they come to visit us, which they do fairly regularly for 5, 6, 7 weeks, we design a tour for them. It's depending on what their interests are, and we will take them, for example, to regulatory boards. In Ontario, we have the Ontario Energy Board that regulates the electricity and gas sector. It's a quasi-judicial process, and it's eye-popping for them. I mean, it is really, really interesting for them to see this. Last time we were there, one of the staff members who met with one of our colleagues said, you really ought to have this book. And it's a book that is called The Regulator's Bible. And apparently everybody around the world uses this. It was written 50 years ago, and it is just sort of the standard that everyone refers to when they're trying to figure out how to regulate fairly so that investors in the gas or the electricity sector can be properly compensated for their investments, but not allowing them to gouge consumers. So it establishes all of these various principles. So we got a copy of it, gave it to our colleagues, they're translating it. So this is really powerful. I mean, we have done a lot of the groundwork in the detail of how to hold lawmakers accountable. And it's not to say that they're going to adopt it holus bolus, but they can look at it and they can say, okay, this is, here are parts we can take and here are parts that we can use. And this I think is also a very it's a very helpful tool. I'll just tell you one last anecdote. I took a colleague of mine who led a very interesting that I referred to, a very interesting access to information lawsuit. He applied to the Three Gorges Corporation, the Ministry of Finance, and the State Council for details of Three Gorges cost. He was refused at all levels. This is under their new access to information law. And so he appealed the decision to the courts. And first court rejected his appeal. So he appealed to the next level of court. And it rejected his appeal. And at each stage of his attempt to get this cost information, more and more media started covering his story. First, it was at the internet level. The internet press covered it. Then the what they call the marketable press, the more open, aggressive newspapers and magazines, mostly in the south part of China, started covering it. Then eventually the official media started covering it. And one of the journalists asked him, why are you doing this? And he said, I'm just like any other ordinary Chinese citizen. I just want to know, how is the government spending our money? And that journalist then started referring to him as Citizen Ren. His name was Ren Qinghui. And he became a national hero. And people around the country said, yeah, we just want to know, how is the government spending our money? So I think it's all of these small innovations and these sort of individual examples help. We took Ren Qinghui to visit the Information and Privacy Commissioner in Ontario. This was now 2 years ago, and she is the parliamentary appointed watchdog, or she's really got a legal status, and she's in charge of making sure that the government abides by the law, and she will defend citizens who appeal for information and are refused. And we went to have a meeting with her and her staff, and they said to Ren Qinghui, they said, well, what do you think? I mean, what do you think of our work and of our organization? And he said, I'm so surprised that there aren't armed guards at the front of the office building stopping people from coming in or scrutinizing people as they come in. And this particular commissioner had a campaign among access to information commissioners around the world called Privacy by Design and Access to Information by Design. And she was designing ways to embed actually into data management. First of all, how governments can more readily release information, and also how privacy can be built into data systems as well. And in that case, Qinghui took those various documents and said, this is wonderful for the Chinese public, gave it to Transparency China, they've translated it, it's now circulating around the country. So it's all of these little advances, I think, ultimately will account for a lot.
I hate to be the party pooper because I think our time is up, but I want to thank you for a very intriguing presentation, and thanks everyone for coming, and I hope